Welcome back to the Net Zero and ESG stage. Up next, we have our first panel discussion called Building a Workplace That is Imposter Syndrome Free. We have two guests joining this panel discussion. So first we have Tara Wilson, who is the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Diversity Officer at Zum Rails. She leverages her subject matter expertise and 20 years plus experience to implement operational excellence to bring strong, scalable solutions to support Zum Rails' rapid growth in the fintech industry. Tara has also oversees companies' commitment to building a foundation to support evolving practices, focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Joining her will be Kirti Daryanani, who combines her international roots with 20 years of experience in diverse. I'm going to start that again. 20 years of experience in diversified communities globally. We got there in the end. She's an international keynote speaker on code switching and intersectionality, a multilinguist, and the author of #BefriendYourMind. Kirti provides corporate companies with training, including presenting and communicating in diversified communities and intersectional well-being. So please welcome Tara and Kirti. Apologies for that, ladies, and welcome. There was a few long descriptions there, so I had to get through those, but hope you're excited for this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you for having us. Hi, Tara.
Hi.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to kick off with the first conversation topic, which is what is imposter syndrome? Perhaps maybe both of you could answer this. Kirti, I'm going to go to you first.
Thank you, Tom. Imposter syndrome, well, by definition, it's the psychological attributes that a person goes through from the inside, the internalizing of their self-doubts, their fears, their worries, and processing it, and how that limits them from communicating in the environment surrounding them. I think that would be the description that's most modern, encapsulated for today.
Of course. And Tara, do you have anything you may want to add to that in terms of your experience?
I would say that's exactly the perfect definition. I don't know if I could add much more. I think there's a lot more feelings behind that, but that's what we're going to get into today.
Of course, yeah, and particularly it's become a big topic these days in the corporate world. So Kirti, maybe you could tell me why imposter syndrome is so prevalent at the moment.
Well, at the moment, it's prevalent because if you look at how much information is out there, we're always searching and seeking to so-called improve ourselves because our doubts, that's what doubts does, and worries and fears, we're always trying to find some solution. So there's so much information out there. Competition is much higher. We've placed much more higher expectations on ourselves. And that's why we're always afraid to fail, or we're always afraid how people will perceive us, because it's a lot about impressions now. And with all that massive information, we're living and walking in a sort of a comparison age. And so when we show up in the workforce, it's becoming more competitive amongst one another. And you see that quite often, especially with more opportunities for different diverse communities now, where everyone's like, well, who gets to go to that higher up position? Because as we go higher, the positions get more limited in that sense.
Of course. And Tara, maybe you could kind of run me through what the main factors are in terms of those who experience imposter syndrome, particularly in the workplace. And is there any way that they can educate people more on the situation?
Yeah, I think absolutely there's an opportunity to educate. I don't necessarily think that imposter syndrome comes solely from the workplace or poor education or mentorship. I think it really comes from, there's a lot of well-established entrepreneurs who have shared that they've had top-tier education and many impressive mentors, and they still have those feelings of imposter syndrome. I think it often comes really from your own past experiences and of feelings of just not being good enough for the role, or maybe even for the company. And there's a lot of putting pressure on yourself to get up to speed quickly when you're doing something new and comparing yourself to others. And I think just to couple with the last question, one of the reasons why I'm finding it so prevalent in the moment is because there are a lot of employees that are going through employment transitions. So they're starting, there's the great resignation, and they're starting new roles, and they're finding new fields of work. And, there's a bit of a different culture since COVID happened, since the pandemic happened. And I think that pressure to start something new, to find transferable skills, and to be as successful as possible, as quick as possible, can be quite overwhelming.
Sure, and I can imagine with especially a lot of big career transitions happening at the moment, and maybe there's a lot of people that are, they don't really know what experience they can pull into that role, which is kind of a expertise in itself. But who is kind of likely to get imposter syndrome? Is it more of an industry thing, or is it more relating to the person? Maybe Kirti, you can answer that one for us.
I think that's a tricky question. From my experiences working with clients, I just see it across the board. I think everybody has doubts. We all have worries. We're always judging ourselves much more than we want to show others. And to echo with Tara, when we're looking for new fields and we're exploring post-COVID, you are always wanting to also show up with the best impression. So there's this constant feeding ourselves with information. Am I doing this right? And so to say which industry has more, it also depends very much on how high the competition is as well, and how competitive it gets, and how much we're comparing ourselves. And I think in different industries, it does vary. Data, it varies in a different way. And I think we have to always remember that when we talk about imposter syndrome, it's complex. It's not just a one size fits all. It depends very much on the conditions and the upbringing of the person, their culture. And so to say which industry, I think it limits us to some extent.
Yeah, I would share the same sentiments and say that, for those who I've spoken with, and even for myself, I find a lot of individuals who have imposter syndrome are people who grew up with parents or family members that put a lot of stress on being successful in school or in sports or overall, and that importance of just achieving. And that really ends up carrying over in professional life. And I absolutely, agree that we're making it a smaller issue by saying they might be specific industries. But I can give an example of, you may find, me being in the tech space, finding that, IT, for example, you may find often that it's a male-filled industry, and that women may have feelings of not belonging, or that they're highly skilled as their male counterparts, but it doesn't just stop there. So.
Sure, and actually, I was going to come to you, Tara, as well, because there's this kind of stimulus that Gen Z is kind of more of a generation that experiences imposter syndrome a lot more. Do you think that's true? Do you think it's a generational trauma? And are you seeing this at Zum Rails?
I wouldn't. I think it can be related to unhealed trauma. I think a lot of things can be related to unhealed trauma. And I think that we might be of a generation of more communication and more awareness and more understanding. And just down to the bones of it, as humans, we have needs for feeling safe, for feeling love, for feeling belonging. And, just to speak to what we spoke to before, coming from very high pressured families or childhoods, can relate to imposter syndrome and can be, layered into that. I think when certain needs aren't met, for us as I don't want to speak too out of turn, but just when certain needs aren't met for us as we grow into humans, into good people, or try to grow into good people, it can pose a challenge in growing our self-esteem and our sense of identity. And so I think that all can be related. As specific to Zum Rails, we're a newer company with less than 50 employees, so I don't think it's correct to say that I'm seeing it as a trend per se. But I have absolutely had discussions directly and indirectly about imposter syndrome with members of the team.
Sure, and obviously, as you kind of mentioned there, it's a lot about upbringing and nurture, and you've got a lot of people coming into the organization with these kind of set feelings already in their minds, I guess. But Kirti, who's responsible for making sure that employees are, they feel safe and comfortable in the workplace, and particularly when they're experiencing imposter syndrome?
I find it a very tricky question. I'll go back to that trauma. I think one thing that we eliminate, or not eliminate, we underestimate is how cultural history plays a big role in trauma, especially in the workplace. So when I work with code switching, for example, where people they change their appearance, they change their accent, they change their way of speaking just to fit in. And can employees do something? We sometimes employees really don't know when to catch it either. And so when we talk about generational trauma, there's a little more heightened awareness or a little bit more discernment. And I think that's the word I'm looking for in a conversation, is how do you discern as an employee, and how do you not get too involved that the way you think is the way it's supposed to be, and being able to look at the complexity of every person from an employee standpoint. It requires a different way now where we navigate communication and we navigate our words, our language. It's easy to say we have to be inclusive, but inclusive can also and often be seen as a tick box. And when it becomes a tick box, then what we're trying to do is because two people are in a conversation, so an employee and the employer, or you can say a department, it depends very much who has the power and the influence in that conversation. And so when when you're saying who is responsible, all parties are responsible, but you want to be responsible for your languaging, for how you're going to feel. How is the environment brave enough, not safe, brave enough to navigate challenging conversations surrounding trauma, surrounding, look, I'm not comfortable with this. And the person may not know, even if they're from the corporate side or the company side. How do you navigate allowing fear of failures or mistakes or judgments to be present? And then we pivot it accordingly. So to say employee who's responsible, any individual who's engaging becomes responsible, because that's your feelings and your emotions in imposter syndrome.
Of course, and particularly in the corporate environment, there's a lot of trend around kind of finding metrics to analyze these certain different parts of ESG. And obviously that kind of fits into the social one, which I think is probably a more subjective one to kind of measure. But are there any metrics that you can measure in terms of imposter syndrome to determine whether you're successful in overcoming? I mean, how would that look?
I think it's hard to say specifically that you could measure imposter syndrome. I mean, you can always do surveying and you can always speak to it, but if people don't know what it is, then it's hard to measure it. So, to go back to the conversation, to add on, normalizing difficult conversations, talking about what imposter syndrome is a great way for people to understand it and talk through it and find solutions for it. Myself, I didn't know what it was until I read the book Lean In. I thought it was a Tara thing. I didn't understand that other people felt that way. And it was actually like part of my repertoire to say, oh, everyone's going to find out that I've tricked them. I don't deserve to be here. That was something that I felt for many years. So I think, metrics are hard. What I would rather see is tools. Rather than metrics on, hey, did we solve the imposter syndrome saga, the issue that exists? Let's provide tools to management to help recognizing imposter syndrome. Let's provide tools to the staff so they can recognize it in themselves and start to switch out those negative thoughts with positive ones. And I think education, knowledge sharing, mentorship programs, those are the ways. I would say I'd much rather see that than a metric specific investment in the workforce, and how to recognize it and how to train and how to change. I love what you just said. Feelings aren't facts is one of my favorite sayings. Those feelings of self-doubt. How do we change those feelings that we think are facts in our head and change them to be more positive and to see our successes? So I don't know. Do you have any ideas for metrics? I don't for this one specifically, but Kirti, maybe you do.
I think when I think about metrics, I'm mostly, and it's not really metrics, because I think your data is one thing, but there's often, at least in diverse communities, there's always, am I safe to say what I really truly feel? And then when you don't feel safe how you really truly feel, how effective are those metrics? Is it really telling you the real story? And I believe in, and I do echo about having better tools, but I would say more than that, getting companies or corporates to create pods of communications. We have ERGs, we have employee resource groups. One thing we're always concerned about, and especially in marginalized groups or diversity with imposter syndrome, you're always concerned about your survival. And that's what actually metric says. It says, in this day and age, and the trends where we're seeing a lot of redundancies, it's always already leaning towards who resigns first and who gets redundant. And you see the numbers already sharing that we haven't really moved that narrative forward. So where you want to look at metrics is not as much as how are we engaging and facilitating conversations of differences. And how do we, when you have imposter syndrome, how do you navigate being not so caught up and personal with your stories and your beliefs, so that you can assess situations with a level of, where is this leading us together? Where is this going to head, that we are all going towards this together? And this is where leadership also has to be very aware of managing their style and tone of communication for different audiences.
Yeah, and I want to touch upon that point you said about awareness, because obviously, some of these things in terms of imposter syndrome can be deep within us, and they're not necessarily worn out in the open. How do leaders really recognize that this is a problem? Like, they could see their employees working day in, day out without even noticing that they have, issues deep down in terms of, their work and how it's affecting their work. How do leaders kind of pick up on these things? Maybe Kirti, you could respond to that one.
Oh, I'm smiling because I'm thinking about this workshop I'm delivering, and I didn't expect it, and it was about getting senior directors to become better allies, and I just thought, ooh, what a workshop! But then it was very much, it made me think: do I want to speak at them, or do I want them to have tools to put it into place and then practice it out, and then come back and do a 360 degrees on themselves? How effective has my strategy been? And so when it comes to leaders and speaking to a lot of executives, there's, as you go further and further and further, also your imposter syndrome changes, right? The nature of it changes because expectations are different. And who are you trying to impress also plays a big role. And so you have to look from a bird's eye view, take a stock of your communication agenda and your relationships, and know when you need to manage you need to speak to different levels, so that you know as a leader where you're at and what you can pivot and change, and then take it back and be human about it. And I know that's not the word that we're looking for, because in corporate jargon, we can get caught up in all these big words, but it's back to humanizing ourselves and making us feel part of belonging is you're not presenting as perfect. And I think that is one thing that will definitely reduce perfectionism, and having that conversation around it.
Interesting. Yeah. And Tara, do you think this is kind of an increasing issue, especially from the work from home environment? I mean, we're discussing here right now from across the world. Do you think that imposter syndrome is harder to kind of manage in the digital era?
Yeah, I absolutely think working from home is part of the issue. I think we can all relate to getting an email or a Slack message where we can't decipher the tone or the context behind it, and then we get into our own heads about it. We, that reduction of personal contact leads us to overthink and overanalyze. So I think it's part of it. And I think one of the other things is that we maybe kind of touched on is social media. There is a huge influence today that's an outside influence that's coming from social media. And there was an obscene amount of screen time coming out of the pandemic or during the pandemic. And you have these 30-second clips of people showing that they've succeeded, that they have this car or this brand, or they're partnered this way, and these perfect lives and these perfect situations, and it's easy to compare. And so I think definitely with maybe a rise on screen time, a rise with influence from social media, not having that connection with your colleagues in the same way that you used to, that can definitely put you in your own head and make you compare yourself against others.
Sure. And Tara, would you say you've done that in the past yourself? What experiences have you had with imposter syndrome? I'm curious to know.
Yeah, one of the things that I think come from imposter syndrome is that it can be, it can come from a lot of different places, and it can be conditioned inside of the workplace as well. So if you are attending meetings and you're told often that you're very lucky to be attending those meetings, or there's comments that are made like, oh, here, I'll draw from my own experience. And I don't think this was malicious. I want to be very clear. I don't think that at the time these were malicious comments, but, walking into a boardroom full of men and saying, oh, who invited you to the big boys meeting today? Like comments like that, or comments where, oh, you're lucky to be included, start to condition you to believe that you are actually lucky and that you do not deserve it. And so that was part of my imposter syndrome, is that I was part of a culture. Again, I don't think it was malicious, but part of a culture that very male dominated, and felt often that I was talked over, that it was brought up often that I was the only woman in the room, and that I was told, that I wasn't there because of my subject matter expertise. I was there as a tick box, or that they were allowing me to take notes, and kind of these really, specific offside comments. So for me, it was really, and then I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what imposter syndrome was. So I didn't know how to combat it. And it took me going to a new organization that had a brilliant culture, and understanding that I was being invited, at the table to speak because I deserved to be there, because of my subject matter expertise, which I have a lot of. And so sometimes I think it has to do with your environment, where you are, what the culture is, does it align with your values? And if you go into work every day and you feel bad, and you need to listen to that. If you don't feel appreciated, if you don't feel like you're having belongings, and just there's that happens now in simple things like not being called on in meetings where you're not being included. So you're being excluded. Am I being excluded because I'm not good enough? And you self-internalize that. When there's outings and you get iced out, and then the next day there's a big conversation with everyone showing pictures and laughing, and you're the only person on the team that didn't get invited. Those things can contribute. So for me, my experience was many moons ago, I was inside of an organization that didn't recognize that they were conditioning me to feel like I didn't belong.
And do you think, so Kirti, do you think that is kind of the general thing that happens in terms of someone coming into an organization and then feeling imposter syndrome, or can it be something that they already hold within them as they enter a new job?
it's twofold. It's one, you are going to come in with whatever you've been conditioned to, how you've been raised and grown. Listening to Tara, I'm smiling only because I had two layers of imposter syndrome. I had the layer of, in my own culture, being Asian by descent, but also Dutch. It's two extremes. So as an Asian woman, you were not allowed to really have, and during my time, you weren't really allowed to have ambition. So whenever you rose and as an entrepreneur, you didn't really feel ambitious enough. And then you have men always saying to you, well, why are you ambitious? Your ambition should be to get married. That's what my ambition was supposed to be. And so anytime you grew further and further, it was always like, well, that's because the male in your family supported you. And so you never knew how to take credit. And then when you go into the outer world, you experience another layer where you cannot discern between discrimination and imposter syndrome. It starts becoming really a shade of gray. Now, you said, okay, well, if you enter a corporate or you enter a company or you enter an organization, and it goes back to that question you once asked about education. There's also the training that happens in the talent and development. How are you integrated? And how much allowance is there for your own identity to show up? So really having to be aware of your experiences from your past, from your way you've been raised, your conditions, bringing that in and knowing how to evolve and work with it, with the corporate culture. So it really starts at the moment you enter. And that entry point, that integration point is very crucial. How are you going to set the tone for your career further on? I always tell my clients, have a relational agenda. Let's schedule that out, because building your relations is also building your relationships with yourself. And as you progress, you can navigate yourself without imposter syndrome constantly hitting at you and doubting you the whole time.
Of course, yeah. And I want to kind of jump back to the conversation on work from home, because I've noticed that time's getting away from us. We're getting very close to the end. But in terms of working from home, what advice, Kirti, would you give to any kind of employee or person who kind of feels a sense of imposter syndrome?
Communicate. I know we don't like to communicate online, but I do think there is value in right now when we're conversing. There's still facial expression, there's still tonality. Making your Zoom call like a bit of the water cooler effect where you didn't have it before. Make time for that. You do want to network still, because what you don't know, you will become to know, and that can shift your doubts inside of you and your fears. You want to know how to ask questions. And building your relationship and network, because you're home alone, develop your relationship and how to communicate with others so that it'll support you along the way.
Of course. And Tara, do you have anything else that you'd like to add onto that point?
Yeah, I think, something that's really helped me and many that I've mentored is just keeping track of your success. So if we're just talking about the basis of imposter syndrome, you have to celebrate your own success, and hopefully you're at an organization that holds that value important. But if it isn't, or it's operationally, we're on to the next one before the other one's even done. So sometimes we always don't get that chance to celebrate success. So start an Excel document, a Word document, keep track of all your projects and your achievements, keep track of your KPIs. And I think the other piece is just knowledge is power. Take advantage of any learning and development inside your organization, like LinkedIn Learning. Take any courses about your line of work, how to be a good communicator. And I think that will just help grow your self-esteem and your abilities. And if they're not available, then speak to your management training about it. And last, attend events like this. This is a great event to attend, to talk through it, to understand it, to get resources, to continue the conversation outside.
For sure. And maybe we'll have to continue this conversation outside, as you say, because we've come to the end of our session. But thank you very much, ladies. It's been great to talk to you both, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for joining us on our first panel session. We'll be back in a few moments for the next session of the day.